Yes. So good morning, everybody. I'm Mayor Schulman with the Foundation's Nonprofit Support Program, and I want to welcome you all to our workshop on strategic alliances. So I'd like to start, as always, by thanking my wonderful colleague Monica Kelly for all of her expert assistance behind the scenes in helping to plan and manage logistics for today's session. So Monica and I are part of the Nonprofit Support Program, which is the Foundation's organizational capacity building arm. So we help to strengthen nonprofit organizations and support leaders. And of course, if there are ways in which the Nonprofit Support Program can help with your organizational capacity building needs, please do reach out to us. We realize that with today's topic that there are a whole host of reasons why nonprofits start exploring the option of strategic alliances. So sometimes it's challenging times that make nonprofits think about joining forces with others. Sometimes it's to expand the scope of programming and to serve a broader array of people and communities. Sometimes it's to expand your credibility, visibility, and potential funding opportunities. And sometimes there are other strategic reasons why this type of an exploration makes sense. So regardless of the reason, I think it can be a useful exercise for nonprofits to consider this as an option as part of their kind of strategic thinking and planning. And the now Nonprofit Support Program does have a resource that might be helpful to you, which is our Technical Assistance Grants, or TAGs for short. These grants can be used to hire a consultant that you would choose to facilitate an exploration of a strategic alliance with one or more organizations. In order to be eligible to access the technical assistance grant, a nonprofit must primarily serve the Hartford region and be aligned with the foundation's strategic priorities. I'm sure that as we go through today's topic, you will have questions. So please feel free to enter your questions in the chat at any time during the session while it pops into your head. And our presenters will also be staying on immediately following the presentation for a Q&A period, and we won't be recording that part. So please enter questions in the chat or feel free to save them for the Q&A period. We will also be posting a short survey in the chat towards the end, and we'll send you the survey immediately following the session. It's the only price of admission, as we like to say, and we really do value your feedback and take your comments to heart. So please take just a couple minutes and complete that survey. That's all I have, and now I'm delighted to turn the program over to our presenters from FIO Partners, Ann Urashik, who's Managing Principal, and Melissa Harris, who's Director of Service Development. So Ann and Melissa, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Urashik, as Mayor said, and on behalf of the whole FIO Partners team, thanks so much to the Foundation for allowing us to continue to hold space on a topic that's really of increasing interest to many of the nonprofits and leaders we work with. I want to take a minute and thank my co-presenter, Melissa Harris, from our team for being with us this morning. Melissa, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Melissa, and I'm very excited to be here today. This is, as Ann said, a really important topic. And as Mayor mentioned, while sometimes it's a conversation that's initiated because of a time of stress, it also has wonderful creative potential in terms of the community impact that can be created through working together with other organizations. So excited to explore the range of opportunities with you.
Great. And as Melissa shared and Mayor shared, please go ahead and introduce yourself in this chat. Share your name and your organization. I love to encourage what I call professional connections as part of these webinars. If you spot someone you've met before or someone you want to connect with, please connect with each other on LinkedIn. We really are an incredible community of nonprofit leaders here in Connecticut. And as much as we can share our wisdom and perspectives with you, there's so much opportunity to also learn from each other. So please take a minute to scroll through the chat and don't hesitate to connect with others on today's webinar. If this is your first time hearing about FIO Partners, we are a national social sector consulting firm that's based here in Connecticut. FIO is Latin for become. We partner with the organizations we work with to become the organizations they envision, and we only work in the social sector with nonprofits, foundations, collaboratives, government agencies, as well as their boards. And our work is around leadership decision making. We really work with leaders to really identify those moments in an organization's trajectory where shared decision making, bringing different voices to the table, is really powerful. And we do that in a number of ways through strategic planning, supporting strategic alliances, leadership advisory, executive search and succession, as well as research and training. And so, very excited to be with all of you today. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, stalk Melissa and I in the most appropriate way. But really excited to be having this conversation. And oftentimes we get asked, why does FIO do this work around strategic alliances? We are in our 19th year as a firm. And when we started the firm, I started it with Jane Arsenault, who wrote one of the first books around forging nonprofit alliances in the social sector in 1999. So since our inception, we have really worked with clients to really support envisioning in so many ways things that people can't see. Community impact
Mhm.
coalitions, programmatic collaborations, joint ventures, management service organizations, service networks, parent corporations, and of course, mergers and acquisitions. And we'll explore all of that in today's very sort of fast-paced webinar. We're excited to really ground you in this topic and hopefully really inspire you to begin to think about collaboration really as a strategic choice and something that you can really prepare for. Melissa.
Thank you. So, as Mayor mentioned, today we are going to have 75 minutes of content where Ann and I are going to jam through a lot of useful information. And at the end, we are going to have some Q&A time where we will turn off the recording. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat as we go. So will Ann. So if you have general questions as we go through, please feel free to use the chat. If you have a more specific or sensitive question, just know that we'll have that space at the end that's not recorded where you can share. We also, a lot of these slides, we'll talk about the concepts, but we wanted this deck to be a resource for you all. So there are going to be some models, some slides that are pretty content heavy, because we wanted you to be able to turn back to this material after the session and be able to reference the deck as a resource. There's also a companion workbook that you'll be getting. So we'll introduce some exercises that you can do to really start thinking about clarifying your why for partnership and preparing your organization to really develop and pursue some win-win-win partnerships, as we like to call it. And that's going to be a big part of our content for today, along with just really making you familiar with the range of partnership options. A lot of times we'll do this in either like a full day or a multi-session presentation where we will really dig into the structures. Today, we're just going to give you some of the highlights and really just help you understand, and we'll get into this, that there is a purpose or a reason why you might select different structures, but that really it starts with getting clear about that why for partnership and then backing into what those potential structures might be that support that purpose.
So let's talk about the environment. One of the things we just want to acknowledge, and I think this might be the toughest slide in this deck, is that around the social sector, the environment continues to change. And since really sort of January of 2025, the sector has been facing its latest wave of substantive change. Whether it's in so many ways the renegotiation of government with the nonprofit sector in terms of funding freezes or not, the need for sector contraction in terms of particular revenue streams really just kind of shutting down, either with no notice or some notice. We are recognizing that as the post-COVID investment kind of in the sector, as more time goes by and those funds are depleted by organizations that have struggling business models, we're seeing more and more what I call kind of operating challenges, and whether that's cash flow, whether it's sort of like expenses really are outrunning the revenue that's coming in. Delays in revenue are really painful right now for many entities. We are seeing some increase in leadership transition. The
Mhm.
philanthropic landscape continues to shift and be challenging in terms of shifting donor fatigue and or shifts at the corporate side, and in mirroring that incredible high demand for services. And yet, I think we also are seeing tremendous innovation and creativity in the last 18 months
Mhm.
as organizations really pivot with the substantive, quick changes in the environment. We've seen an uptick in scenario planning. We've really seen people get really clear, really fast about what's most important to them, make hard decisions, begin to think about what is their business model in this uncertain environment. And we really are seeing, and I think it's important for folks on the call today to recognize over 80 people registered for this webinar.
Mhm.
In the past, we've run this webinar for 15 people, 12 people, 10 people. Like this has not been a topic, I think, over the last decade that has generated enormous interest, very different from this moment today. And so I think the opportunity, as much as this is a challenging slide, the opportunity for leaders to really say, we are focused on a cause together. What does it mean to do that work differently in this moment? And so I just want to
Yeah.
acknowledge and have you begin to reflect on, what is changing around you?
Yeah.
What are some of the trends that are impacting you? What are some of the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing in this very uncertain environment? And as we go through the next couple of slides, feel free to drop those into the chat. I mean, I think in some ways we want to make sure as we're talking about this topic of collaboration that we're really leaning into the experiences that you're having as leaders. We recognize that this moment is variable. Not every organization is
Mhm.
experiencing challenge. Not every organization is in a tough spot. Others are sort of saying, well, we might be in a tough spot later, or we might be in a tough
Mhm.
spot 2 years from now when this XYZ contract either ends or doesn't end. But I think there is an enormous amount of perception of stress in the sector at this moment. But I really want to call in just also the real interest in collaboration and the real opportunity that we have as leaders.
Absolutely. And disruption often inspires innovation. So, as we look at the things that are either broken or perhaps should be broken, we're looking at, having conversations around how should we be doing things differently? What are the opportunities we see to actually center community impact again and really focus on either how we can innovate our individual business model or the business model in collaboration with other entities in order to really make some difference even in the face of sometimes radically major shifts in the operating environment. And so that's why we say top challenges are opportunities. So as you feel able, please feel free to share those in the chat again. I think it also just helps to normalize the fact that folks are experiencing both challenges and opportunities in this environment. So just to know that you're not alone, no matter kind of how you are envisioning things right now. And that really brings us to the central question that is driving today's exploration. Could your organization advance its mission more effectively alone or by partnering with others? Again, business model innovation may mean that you are uniquely positioned in your community, and with some innovation, you really can do something effectively alone. Other times, you may say, you know what, this is something that is an issue or a business model challenge that really does warrant partnering with others in a really meaningful way in order to really advance what it is that we're working towards as an organization. So we have this, the picture of folks kind of climbing the mountain together because that is so often what the work feels like. And again, so just to think about this metaphor of climbing that mountain, can you do it on your own, or would a team really help you be able to do that more effectively? And so it starts with clarifying your why. We really want organizations, something that is important to our approach to strategic alliances, is really having organizations stop and take stock and get clear about their why for partnership before they proceed and try to start thinking about the what or the how of partnership. And that journey really begins with all of you as individual leaders. We've all had nonprofits partner all of the time in small and large ways. And that means as leaders, you've all had experiences with good and not so great partnerships. And so when you think about what it means to collaborate with other organizations, it's important to stop and think about what experiences you've had in partnering. What do you view as the qualities and behaviors as a good partner? What lessons have you learned from collaborations that didn't go so well, that are kind of your cautionary tales around what you want to make sure to avoid or do differently in partnerships in the future? And how might those experiences make you hesitant to partner? And to be able to name those and think about those is important so that as those emotions come up when you hear terms like partnership or merger, you can really think about, how is it that you want to enter into another opportunity for collaboration in a way that is going to be really effective and mutually beneficial. And do you have anything you want to add to this one?
Yeah, I just want to call
Yeah.
in, Melissa, this idea of leadership is not just you as executive directors. There's a bunch
Mm,
of comments in the chat about board engagement being kind of a current challenge. And I just want to call in that these experiences with partnership really are not just with executive directors or CEO, that every board member
very true.
has some type of history, whether it's in their own lives, being part of a merger that didn't go well, on a corporate merger perhaps. And so we have to recognize that these questions about mindset are a wonderful way to start just a beginning conversation between a CEO and its board around how do we think about partnership? It's not just the CEO. I just want to really call the importance of board members into this conversation.
Absolutely. And Anne alluded to it, when we were kind of talking about what we're seeing in this moment of time. But one of the things that is coming up really is this idea of a network leader mindset. Janeway Skillern is really sits behind board sources, principled, or what is it called? Purposeful board leadership. And she really puts forward four counterintuitive principles that are essential to effective collaboration. And so, as we're thinking about what it means to be a good partner, what it means to partner in this moment in time, but also in generally, there are some mindsets that are really important to helping organizations come into these conversations in a really authentic and productive way. And it starts with thinking about mission, not organization. So, again, how do we put the community impact that we're really trying to achieve at the center of the organization, as opposed to individual identities as an organization, individual aspirations? Of course, we're going to have those. But as we're talking about collaboration, how do we really make sure that community impact is the thing that's at the center of the conversation? Because we need to expand beyond individual interests in order to do that something greater. That also includes really having trust in our partners as opposed to a lot of control, and understanding with humility where we are best positioned to take a lead, what are our strengths and assets that we bring to the table, and the same of our partners. Where are our partners really positioned to take a lead in a combined effort to drive community impact? And so, again, all of that comes down to this idea of, as organizations, we are nodes working towards a collective impact as opposed to being the center of the conversation. And I have to say, prior to FIO, I worked in nonprofit branding and communications. And so I understand the value of telling your organization's story so that you can generate the support that you need in order to do your work. And so that's not to discount the importance of all of that, but to say when we're talking about collaboration, there's a bit of a shift in stance that needs to happen so that it becomes about something even greater than us as an individual organization.
Melissa, I think one of the things I
Mhm.
want to call in on this slide as well, and maybe I'm going to beat the board drum a little hard as we go through this, is I think this slide in particular can be really helpful to boards, and Jane
Yes,
Waith Gillern's work really has informed some recent work out of Board Source around purpose-driven boards, and
yes.
really can be a very helpful resource to boards as we think about collaboration. Boards really can come to this work with that sort of self-interest, like what about our entity? What about our organization?
Hmm.
And I really think that this work about, mission, not organization, trust, not control, is a really, again, helpful dialogue in preparation for boards to begin to engage in partnership discussions.
So again, all of this is about making the conversation about your organization's why. As we think about why we would work in partnership or in collaboration with another organization as opposed to going it alone, we need to be really clear about that. And another thing that really helps in trying to establish that clarity is taking that step back to think about your organization's current context and its desired future. So, looking externally beyond your organization, what is happening in your environment, both locally? So, what are some market conditions that may change, regulatory changes, funding changes, things that are happening within your community? And where does that leave you kind of in positioned in your market? And when I say that, I mean, are you the only game in town who's providing a really critical service that's super important to the community? Or are there multiple organizations that are providing the same service? If there are, kind of how do you stack up in relationship to those other organizations? Are you really excelling in that work? Or is it something that, this happens to organizations where you take on a body of work over time, usually in response to either a funding opportunity or a need that a subset of your clients have, and you're just okay at it. But when you're thinking about where should we focus our time, our energy, our resources, is it something that you should continue doing if you're not well positioned to continue doing that work? There's also looking at your relationships. So, again, as you think about other organizations that are serving your community, serving those that you serve, what relationships do you already have? Nonprofits work in relationship with one another all the time. And often these conversations around how might we deepen or develop a new partnership start with looking at those folks that we already have relationship with. Then there's looking internally and saying, of course, what is your financial position? There is an element of urgency here. So if you are in a strong financial position, it means you can really think more proactively, more generatively about what might be possible through an alliance. If you are in a more challenged position, then you need to think about runway. Are we in a position where we can, we have a solid year ahead of us? As Anne said, this year's okay, but we see that next year is going to start being really challenging financially. So, what is it that we need to start thinking about now and developing now so that when the financial challenge comes, we are positioned for sustainability? If it's really short, that narrows the kind of menu of options that you may have in front of you. There's looking
Melissa?
at your program. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump
Yeah.
in on the
Yeah.
internal financial position
Yeah.
perspective. I think one of the things we're seeing across our clients on this issue in particular
Mhm.
really is this idea, what is a vulnerable financial position? We're in some circumstances right now, actually, with a client where there actually are assets on hand. There's 6 months of
Mhm.
revenue remaining in the organization. And the board, though, is so stressed and anxious about the future that they've chosen to wind down. So we do want to acknowledge as we think about these different kind of internal components that what is financially vulnerable, in some ways is how people view it. And so I just want to
Yep.
kind of name that boards can make very intentional decisions about closure or wind down, even when there are still assets that can be basically given to someone else.
Mhm.
If there's, and we'll talk more about that, I think, as we go through, but
Yep.
this idea of assessment around this particular issue, I think, is really, really critical.
Absolutely. There's also your program capacity. Again, what is the need and demand for your services? Is that steady? Is that declining? What story does that tell? And then there's also taking a look at your administrative systems and capacity. And again, this could be an area of strain, or it could be an area of strength where you say, you know what, we have some really innovative systems that could, or access capacity that could be a resource to other organizations. And then, of course, it's looking at that desired future. What is your desired impact on the community? What is the future strategy that you are looking to implement? And what is the direction of leadership? We are often seeing that leadership transition is one of those precipitating events that will have an organization pause and consider, should we be looking for our next executive director, or is now the time to actually consider a strategic alliance? Because any number of reasons, this may actually be the opportune moment to pivot how we are doing the work and how that work is led moving forward. So, in the workbook that you have, we've provided some tools and resources for you. So, we do have a financial health worksheet where you can look at various warning signs. So you could take a look at your audited financials and really just kind of look at, are these warning signs jumping out for you in any of these areas, or are you in a really strong position? We also have resources for you in terms of looking at your external environment around outside and in scenario thinking. And so, what that does is it really allows you to look at what changes may be happening in your environment and think about how those changes can either help or hinder your organization. Then we have an organizational positioning summary that ties all of those pieces together and helps you start getting clear around your organization's core. And we're going to start talking about this in a little bit more over the next slides. Um, and thinking about, as a conclusion, what are some broad program strategies you might want to start considering, and how a strategic alliance could potentially support those strategies. We also have some resources around retrenchment. So, looking at, if you are in a vulnerable position, what are some different ways that you can think about restructuring your organization, even temporarily, in order to get through a difficult time? And so for that work, for the positioning summary, again, it's really looking at that financial position. So, what's the current financial health? What are those major risks to current funding sources? That market position, so the demand, the quality, the extent and cost of competition. If you need to become more competitive in your market, do you have the resources to do that? The level of disruption in your environment and the risk created by that disruption. And that core work, what are you best at? And what work is most essential to fulfilling your mission? I have to say, I have an organization, a client that I worked with last year who was facing some really challenging choices and got really clear about the work that was most essential to their mission and how they thought they could do that work. And so while they had to make some tough decisions around things to let go of, they actually felt some freedom in being able to look at those things that they are best at and really focus on those and say, how can we do this work in a way that is authentic and really going to fulfill our core purpose, and do it in a way that provides really great benefit to our community.
Melissa, before we move
Yeah,
on, I just want to sort of
yeah,
name for the folks on the call, if we go back to that previous slide,
yeah.
this one of the things that's core to FEO partners, and I think it speaks to some of the challenges in the chat around board engagement, that it's really important to name, which is that your board, as it relates to any potential
Mm,
substantive partnership, must be a thought partner in the work no matter what the size of the entity is. Um, there is no substantive partnership that does not require, whether primarily structural partnership, that requires board approval. And when we have low board engagement, if we have low commitment of volunteer board members to these critical conversations, it makes it 10 times harder to get to done. And so I want you to be thinking, as you look at these documents and the positioning summary, particularly if you're executive director, to really use these tools to build board understanding. You can do one tool at a time, do them at a board meeting, really put the organization's information in front of the group of volunteers and decision makers ultimately who will be your partners in discerning your why around partnership. It's a
Hmm.
really critical first step, and I think we hope that the tools that we've provided allow you to have some different conversations with your board that might actually increase engagement and commitment to the organization. And so, Melissa, I just want to kind of start
Yeah,
to tie together sort of
absolutely.
some of the tools with kind of some of what we're hearing in the chat. We really hope that you can use these to create some different conversations.
And some shared understanding so that
Yeah,
as you have those conversations around why looking at a partnership is really important or mutually beneficial to your organization and to your community, that you can have that with some shared understanding of the conditions that are underlying that choice.
absolutely.
So again, as we think about identifying your core, this is such an important concept because whether you are coming at this conversation from a place of strength and proactiveness or a place of vulnerability and trying to respond strategically, identifying your core really allows you to lean into the things that are your strongest competencies, that are most essential to your mission, and realistic in terms of your available resources. And so asking yourself, what is it that we're best at? What is most essential to fulfilling our mission? What could change and what could we let go of? Allows you to really focus on those things that sit at that intersection of your mission, your strongest competencies, and your available resources, and build from there. So either build a right sized organizational structure or business model that's going to allow you to continue to sustain that work that is most important, or allow you to identify those competencies, those assets that you have that really allow you to, scale or innovate or do something really different and build from that place of your most important strength and your strongest value to the communities that you serve. The other thing that I think is important to know, and I definitely want you to weigh in here, is this idea of leadership's will and alignment. So again, we're bringing this back to staff and board, and we really have seen organizations in very different places when it comes to this conversation. Some are scrappy and saying, yes, we are going to figure this out. No matter what is going on in our environment, there is still important work to do. There are people who need X, Y, and Z. And so we're going to figure out how to make this work. We have other organizations that, especially on the heels of COVID, now facing this level of disruption, are tired. And so really thinking about whether your board and your leadership team have the energy to fight for sustainability. What is their willingness to persist? That is something that is showing up in some of these conversations. Um, Whether or not the folks that you have sitting at the table are really able to innovate. That idea of scrappiness, do they have those entrepreneurial mindsets and capabilities that say, we actually see an opportunity here and we can figure out how to have community impact and, build a sustainable revenue stream by doing X. And are they ready to have those kinds of challenging conversations around centering mission and community rather than holding on to programming or organizational structure that the organization has traditionally had? Can they let go and really see this as an opportunity to think differently about how we can do the work that's so important to our communities? So, Anne, can you speak more to this
Yeah.
idea of will and alignment and how we're seeing it show up in these conversations, both on the
Yeah.
positive and the challenging side?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I think that, oftentimes I think about boards, and Melissa's heard me do this talk before, but like boards are a little bit like buses. meaning that they pick up people along the way. And that group of people who are on the bus together, and some people get off and some people stay on, but this group of people ultimately becomes the group of people that must decide when things may be challenging. And the tricky part is it gets like really dark, like when organizations get into a little bit of trouble. Boards get really quiet. It's like they kind of put cardboard on the sides of the windows of the bus, and they're like, no one can leave the bus until we figure out what we're gonna do. And it's really counterintuitive, but what I really want boards to do is actually roll the window down and start shouting outside of the bus, hey, we're not okay. Because a lot of times, what we're seeing with
Yeah.
partnership is that boards are waiting too long to begin to ask for assistance, to engage funders and partners and investors in discussions about their future. And so we have to sort of recognize that, you know, we have to be able to persist. There has to be a group
Hmm.
of board members who are willing to say, this is hard, but I am willing to partner with our team to lead, to determine the opportunities that lie in front of us, which might be really thoughtful transfer of assets. It might be a new partnership that we haven't even considered. But if we get really quiet and we get really insular, we actually really lose the opportunity to develop collaborative
Yep.
opportunities or partnership. Sometimes when we've taught this deck, we have this polar bear sort of floating away on an iceberg because we don't want people to wait too long.
Yeah.
And so, this idea of will, persistence, good information, and then if things are tough, how do you bring more voices to the conversation about how to proceed? So, let's keep going,
Yeah.
Melissa. And I think in a
Yeah.
lot of ways, just acknowledge that these dynamics on boards are really an incredibly complex and important part of the ability of organizations to engage in partnership and
Yeah.
collaborative opportunities.
Well, and I also just want to call in, there's also an element of how do we respond to disruption and what's our tolerance for risk. And
Absolutely.
so, do we see disruption and say, you know what, you know, and start thinking in terms of that innovation, entrepreneurship? Let's see what we can do. What do we have to work with? How can we leverage X, Y, and Z to, do something different? Or are we holding on to the way things have been and how we've always done things? And how does that stifle what opportunities may be present in disruption because we're not willing to let go of certain ways of doing things or certain things that we've always done? That idea of we've always done this and we've always done it this way.
Yeah.
So those mindsets I think are important if you want to be able to also do something generative. And so all of this comes to this idea of what's your why, right? So, how might an alliance help the organization protect, strengthen, or even amplify its impact? And we're going to get to some of these reasons that really are about amplifying impact. What are those internal and external vulnerabilities that could be addressed? Also, same thing with strengths. What strengths could be leveraged? What are the potential risks? What are we most concerned about? I would also say one of the potential risks is of doing nothing. And what do we need to assess or learn more about in order to feel really comfortable and confident with the range of options that are ahead of us and what we need to know in order to decide? So, when we think about the whys, as you look at this screen, yes, there is the ideas over here on the right around protecting programs when the survival of all or part of the entity is in doubt, or sunsetting responsibly if we've reached the end of a runway and we want to make sure clients can access services through another local provider. But the rest of these squares are really about, again, the power of partnership to amplify impact. So we can use partnerships to strengthen programs by adding competencies or services, to build new entities or innovative combinations and approaches, to expand impact by growing market share or geography, expanding funding. A lot of times folks want to see multiple organizations coming together to either address issues in a geography or within a community collaboratively, and that allows you to attract new resources to do something greater than any entity could do alone. And the same thing with strengthening infrastructure. How can collaboration help an organization strengthen its management capacity or its back office administrative capacities? And so what we want you to do is stay focused on your purpose as an organization for considering a strategic alliance for a community impact and really create that win-win-win scenario where there is mutual benefit to the parties involved and ultimate benefit for the communities that you serve. So, understanding the options. This is where we want to give you a brief orientation
Yeah.
to the many flavors of strategic alliance. It is not just mergers and acquisitions, there are many other types of collaboration. So, Anne, do you want to take us through this part?
Yeah. So, as Melissa said, strategic alliances are like Baskin and Robbins flavors. If you've tried one, you've tried one, and there's 101. I want to just acknowledge that there's this real continuum of strategic alliance opportunities from coordination, which is what you do every day through verbal agreements, all the way to consolidation, which is really when we begin to shift the structural legal relationships between entities. And in the middle sits collaboration, which is really this kind of incredible umbrella term that involves increased resources. You might have a written agreement. But again, the sector really focuses on models of coordination and collaboration. But I really want people to begin to say, this idea of partnership, alliance, we use those words really interchangeably, but we really are talking about is a very wide array of options for consideration. There really is noise both at the board level and the sector overall. Like you say, merger, like people panic, they get really anxious. There's so many more ways to think about partnership and alliances, and it's all about this idea of control and risk and cost going from left to right and really decreasing autonomy and the ease of exiting a relationship. So, if I'm borrowing a conference room, thank you, Melissa, for the next slide.
Yeah.
I'm coordinating with a colleague to borrow a conference room on Thursdays at 10, and we get another conference room optioned, not a big deal to switch it. We call Steve, we say, Steve, we're going to use another conference room. We do this all of the time, every day to enact our programmatic work. We make independent decisions as organizations, and these types of coordination relationships are often very low risk and don't involve a lot of investment of resources. I will say that as you begin to shift from left to right, and even in coordination, things can go wrong. And so that's where sort of things get weird, where like your group shows up and Steve gave the conference room to someone else because we never actually wrote down that agreement that we use the conference room on Thursdays at 10. And so when you start to shift from left to right, that's where we actually need to be more explicit about expectations between organizations. We may work together on a joint grant together. We might have a lead partner who's kind of handling the money. We're going to deliver services. This is that collaboration realm. We have increasing degrees of coordination, investment, and risk. And then we move all the way to the right. And this is where we're actually changing the legal linkages between entities and this idea of central authority and reduction on autonomy. I just want to kind of name what those words mean. It means that you stop deciding things by yourself. It means that if you need to hire an executive, if you're the subsidiary of another entity, you might be making a joint leadership decision making about the future CEO. If you've actually merged your organization, you've integrated those leadership teams and you're really making decisions together, no longer making them as independent entities. And so we have to recognize that each of these types of kind of models like serve a purpose. And you'll hear us say this over and over again. It's what's the work that you want to do and what's the structure that helps you get there.
Absolutely. So to take another look at this strategic alliance continuum, these are different types. And again, that organizational health positioning and that purpose are really going to determine the structure of what's needed to do this work. So when we think about program partnerships, this could be about strengthening or expanding the offerings that you have. You're borrowing the competencies of the other partner essentially, or creating a continuum by working in collaboration with others. And there's that potential for attracting funding for collective impact. When we move into these shared structured agreements, that's where we're looking at building that operational capacity, those back office services. Perhaps we're going to share a finance person or an HR person or a marketing person, or there's some larger agreement about shared infrastructure arrangements. And that can allow, frankly, some organizations to be able to focus more on their mission because they're less burdened by the administrative capacities that they need in order to really be able to just focus on the work. Um, with parent subsidiary relationships and mergers and asset transfers, these are those consolidation activities that allow you to strengthen or expand offerings. Now, instead of borrowing competencies, you're building or buying those competencies by forming these strong legal linkages between organizations that, again, can allow you to create a continuum or expand over a geography, build new approaches and innovative new ways of doing things through combination, building operational capacity or scaling an organization, and protecting or transferring programs responsibly if you're looking to, either sunset or sustain impact by moving programs over to another organization who can really sustain that work. We're going to share two slides that really give you a sense of how form really helps to drive, or purpose drives to helps to drive the form. Sorry, let me say that over. How the purpose really helps to drive the form. In all of these different examples we're going to give you, I want you to think about the degree of communication that's needed in these different examples, the kind of information sharing that's needed, the autonomy and decision making. So, again, how independent can our decision making be as we're going through? The amount of resources that are invested and the risk. And so, you'll see as we think about these different ways of structuring collaboration, that it's really about understanding what's involved in terms of the work that needs to be done and the way in which we need to work with each other. So, Anne, why don't you take us through these different examples of joint venture models? Oh, you're on
I'm
mute.
just going to
There
talk
you go.
about each
Yeah,
one a little
yeah,
bit. And
yeah.
again, I think part of what we want to do in this introductory webinar is really, to Melissa's point, teach you that these structural choices are really tied to the why. So in the contractual
Yes.
joint project, it's absolutely something that you do every day. There's a contract, nonprofit 3 in this example holds the contract, nonprofits 1 and 2 provide services. These tend to be shorter term and lower risk, and this should feel really familiar to most of you. We can do examples like in the middle, a partnership agreement where we might have 3 organizations that use existing resources to share a program, deliver a program that leverages their strengths. There's a partnership agreement that is formal, that is signed, that addresses issues like what will we do when something's wrong? How does someone manage
Mhm.
this? There's a lot of particular operational details that need to get worked out to support a partnership agreement. A good example of this is a client of ours actually built a shared training function that sat in one of the entities, but all 3 entities benefited from. And all the way on the right, we have what's called an incorporated joint venture. And this has a lot to do when a set of organizations would like to do something where risk needs to be managed. And this might be creating a separate LLC to really, in some ways, protect the liability of the other players to bring a particular initiative to fruition. And so you can think about this as if we were going to launch a for-profit company together, or we were
Mhm.
going to purchase a building together. We may actually create a separate legal entity that's jointly owned by one or more parties to bring that
Yeah,
to fruition. And it's not uncommon to see this particularly in the use of real estate, social enterprises, and things like that.
absolutely. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have mergers and asset transfers. And of course, this is what a lot of folks think of when they think about strategic alliances. So, Anne, when would this be an appropriate structure to use? And what does it potentially look like?
Sure. And we're just going to hit these two flavors. I want to acknowledge that there's parent subsidiary corporations, there's
Oh,
member
yeah.
substitution models. This is really just indicated to give you kind of a flavor of some of the ideas. But we do mergers and asset transfers when we really believe that the shared work is combined, meaning we have to
Yeah.
integrate the program teams. We want a combined culture, that the work is best served if we bring the teams together and
Yeah.
lower the barriers for coordination. Anything that looks like a program partnership, we're still operating as independent entities. If we really want to work together, we've got to bring the actual human beings together in such a way
Yep.
to do that envisioned work.
And the other thing I want to note just about the asset transfers, going back to this idea of what's your core work and what's essential to your mission and your communities. If you were going through either a time of retrenchment or you were actually just really focusing on how do we just focus our time, energy, and resources on what we do best and really expand on that. And this little piece of work over here really made sense a while ago, but doesn't make sense for us to do anymore. This could be something where, again, you're looking at not necessarily moving the entirety of an organization into another organization, but you could be moving parts or programs of an organization into another organization that could sustain that work.
And the other thing too to think
Yeah,
about, Melissa, just before we jump off of
yeah,
mergers and asset transfers, is this idea of risk and liability.
yeah,
Often in the due diligence process, which is something we'll talk a little bit about before we close out today, something might surface where a particular legal entity has some kind of risk in it, and to
yep,
Melissa's point, really doesn't make sense for the whole entity to kind of come together with another one.
yeah,
And we may,
yep.
in some ways, to your point, Melissa, move some program assets, but actually allow the legal entity to dissolve.
Exactly. And in all of these cases, what we really want to drive again is that purpose and behavior are what are really driving the structural choice. And so, if we can get really clear about that why for a strategic alliance, what is that vision for the shared work, and how do we need to communicate, share information, collaborate, coordinate with one another in order to make that work? That is what really backs us into the decision around what structure is going to enable that. So Anne talked about earlier that role of central authority, and that's really all it is just being clear about the strategic alliance's objectives, the amount of interdependence that's needed, how much does that need to be centralized or not? And what are those coordination costs to be able to complete those tasks collectively? And how much knowledge transfer needs to happen amongst players? And how much does that actually require some kind of central authority in order to make that work? Another way of thinking about this is looking at different types of teams. So I want you to think about, and this comes up, this applies not just to strategic alliances, but to so many different things. Think about community collaboratives you may be sitting in, or just any kind of collaboration within your organization, within your life. It applies to a lot. But think about these different types of teams. So if you have a swim team, success looks like each individual player is really good at running their individual event. And so success is swimmer A, swimmer B, and swimmer C do the best job possible. And with our forces combined, we win. Sequential teams are a relay team. And so, what happens is if you think about organizations where you may have a continuum of services, and so a client is moving from one program setting to another, what is so important in that is actually the handoff. So, you think about a relay team and the importance of handing that baton. So, the communication, the information sharing, that needs to happen in that experience is what actually makes for a really successful experience for the client and has the kind of collective impact we're looking to have there. Then, if you think about a basketball team, what is required for that kind of team to succeed is having a common playbook. Each player needs to individually know what their position calls upon them to do, be really good at their individual skills, but they also have to have that common playbook, be in constant contact with each other, constantly be looking at each other on the court and communicating and throwing the ball back and forth to each other. So, all of this is to say that the different ways that we need to work together, show up for each other in order to have the intended impact, have a huge difference on our understanding of what is really required in order to have success. And where we often see misses is that there's a miss between what kind of team we think we need to be in order for this to work and what kind of team we actually need to be in order for this to work. And so if you're having those moments of tension, this is a helpful model to think about in terms of where may we think we need to act like a swim team, but really we need to pay attention to our handoffs, or really we're actually a basketball team and there is a lot more coordination involved in this conversation than we thought we needed to have originally. Anne,
Yeah, I'll
do
hit a
we
couple
have
of.
time for quick stories?
I'm going to do a really quick story. We have a lot of content that we want to share with
Yeah,
the group today. So I'm
yeah,
going to just draw folks to a couple of examples to say really how structure really does support impact. The Rhode Island Philharmonic Orchestra and the Community Music School was a full merger in Rhode Island, where two very different cultures really came together in so many ways to really bring impact to the community if you're interested in that. Here in Connecticut, the Clifford Beers has created some parent subsidiary relationships with other nonprofits to provide back office services. And in addition to that, I just noted that shared training function, which was done through a partnership agreement. But Melissa, let's try to take this group through some of the nuts and bolts. I know we only have about 20 minutes left, and
absolutely.
we'll dive right in.
Absolutely. So, in terms of preparing to partner, and we're going to talk about boards a lot in this section. So, who should you involve? As you can tell, this is really an intentional process with leaders who are willing to learn and work together to envision the organization's future. So when we think about, whether or not to involve the board, it really depends on, well, what kind of partnership are we talking about here? If this is simple coordination about that, conference room that Anne was talking about, obviously that doesn't need board involvement. As there starts being more money involved, as there's significant risk involved in terms of reputation or sensitive information, those are places where you may need to start thinking about, should the board be at least informed of what's going on here, or do they need to be consulted more deeply? If it's changing strategic direction or changing the legal linkages between organizations, then those are places where your board probably, either in the case of strategic direction, actually both, really needs to be more heavily involved. And so I think that's another thing that's important to talk about no matter what with your boards, whether you're thinking about a partnership at the moment or not, is have you had that conversation with your board about their expectations for alliance thresholds, about whether they should simply be informed, whether they need to be more deeply consulted, or whether they need to be involved in a decision. And what you want to do is to help them be knowledgeable ambassadors and stewards and bring them along in advance of needing their approval. So Anne said, in terms of creating that shared understanding of the conditions that are involved in a strategic alliance, if it's something where they're going to need to be involved in a decision, we definitely want to make sure that they are brought along in the understanding of the why and the conditions that are driving that choice.
And Melissa, let me jump in here. I think the other piece too on this is that you do not need to be in crisis to have this conversation.
Yes.
And in fact, you should have it now if you're not in crisis. Because if you're
Yep.
not in crisis, someone else down the street might be. And so, in order to prepare your board for the phone call you might get
Yep.
that says agency XYZ down the hall is in trouble, they're
Yes.
interested in partnering with us. If you have not been having these conversations with your boards, I promise you that that is going to feel risky, unknown. We shouldn't even
Yep.
consider it. We shouldn't even talk to them. This allows you to advance this discussion before you need it. And so, this idea of
Yeah.
partnership being clear about your why. We talk a lot about this, that this happens in crisis, but in fact, it can be intentional. You can create a partnership kind of point of view. And so the reality is as much as Melissa's right and says, we don't have to talk to our board when we need to get a conference room, 100%. But I would love for us to say that all boards should actually be having a conversation about partnership right now in preparation for what I think is coming in the environment.
Absolutely. I mean, especially if you're in one of those proactive places, to understand why you would entertain a partnership and what it might enable you to do, having that kind of clarity to your point in will just enable you to respond strategically if you get that phone call.
Absolutely. And Melissa,
Recognize an opportunity.
if it's
Yeah.
helpful, I think in a lot of ways, the other questions that we get around sort of establishing a joint group to oversee the process. This is when there's been a phone call. Someone has called
Hmm.
someone and said, we are interested in partnership. And we often get asked, well, what do we do next? We
Yeah.
really recommend that you establish a joint group that may include programmatically at least a mix of staff with maybe limited board involvement. But if this is a potential substantive combination, making sure that we have board involvement from both entities with CEOs and EDs involved is really critical. And we really talk about good heads and good hearts and emotional intelligence as considerations for board members who would participate in these process. They can act as ambassadors, they can oversee the creation of the letter of intent, design the due diligence process, and be really at the table for both designing and engaging the organization in the process itself.
Absolutely. And to Anne's point, around earlier, about being clear with the board around what partnership could look like and what the rules of the road are. What we don't want to do is have those wires get crossed. And so to have folks running off and having conversations really without an understanding of how would we proceed if we see an opportunity for a great partnership or if somebody calls us, really setting expectations about what will happen as we start exploring a partnership is really important in order to make sure that we are, working in a unified way, that it's not going to cause added stress or added resistance to something that could be really beneficial because we haven't established policies and a process to support partnership discussions. So, the other thing in terms of those good heads, good hearts, and emotional intelligence is to remember to get the attitude right. So, as we're starting to have these conversations, there are power dynamics that are inevitably involved, especially if you have organizations that are really of different sizes. And so, Jane in her book really just has a wonderful position around as the relationships unfold, we really need to check those power imbalances. And, as Janeway Skillern would say, really think about how we are making decisions without regard to where each organization sits in terms of like hierarchy of size or finances, and really, again, focusing on the impact and the shared vision for the work. And so it's asking what kind of work do we want to do together? What are our shared values about that work? And then as we're clear about that shared purpose, then you start getting more into the details of to what degree do we need to control activities to achieve our objectives? How do we need to work together? What structure will promote the successful execution of the shared work? But it starts with that idea of what do we want to do? What are our shared values around that work? And then figuring out the details as they fall out of that. And trust is such an important component of these conversations. There are a lot of technical things that are involved in strategic alliances, but they are human interactions and human decisions that involve groups of people talking with each other about what they could potentially build together. And so, inevitably, there are issues of trust, positive or undermining, that end up happening in the course of these negotiations. So, can you talk about that a bit, please?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, as Melissa's noted sort of throughout this, is when you start to get started in this work with a potential partner, this idea of trust of confidence, when someone says, "Hey, I'm going to send you over that document," they actually can do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah,
Contractual, the ability to keep agreements and encourage mutually serving intentions, and the trust of disclosure, which is that you actually communicate honestly and effectively and tell the truth. And I think what people miss sometimes in this work is that this ability to build trust starts from the very first moment of a partner interaction. If you say, "Hey, I'm going to have two board members come to a meeting," and your two board members don't come, you're already eroding trust and you haven't even started yet. And so, this idea of signaling and the idea that trust is reciprocal, it's created incrementally, and how everyone behaves in the process is really critical to bring the
mm,
partnership to fruition. So, talking with your board members about, "Hey, listen, if you can't come to the meeting, please don't commit to it. If you don't have time
yeah,
to be on the committee, that's okay." Because your partner can actually interpret some of those availability issues as trust erosion. Like, do you really want to do this, right? Are you willing to
yeah,
kind of follow through in the agreements that we make? And so I do really think that Melissa and I have been exploring ideas around this idea of the human and the technical. These
yeah,
partnership processes really involve people trusting one another to do this work together to hold mutual benefit. While simultaneously, we have a number of technical tasks that actually have to be completed and agreements that have to be discerned, and we have to capture
yeah.
those in writing. And so it's this combination of people and technical that really
Yeah.
bring these partnerships together.
Exactly. And it's also one of the reasons why when we think about kind of what are some conditions that help with building a partnership, if you have if you have organizations that you're currently in relationship with and you have established trust, you already have a foundation of demonstrated competence, trust of character, trust of communication to continue building upon. If you're in a situation where you're looking at developing a partnership with an organization that you don't have established trust in, know that it's going to take more time because the process itself, you're really testing out in addition to talking about the details of what this thing could be, can I trust this organization? Is this someone that I would want to have a sustained collaboration with? And so take a moment to think about those current collaborators and who might feel most aligned with your organization's purpose. Which ones do you have established trust with? And as you think about your why for deepening collaboration, there's also an opportunity to just really get clear and establish some partner criteria around like what would we be looking for. And so in your workbook, we have a tool for you to be able to map your relationships. So, to think about those organizations you already have a relationship with and determine where there is a potential fit to pursue. If there isn't, we have worked with organizations where they have developed a really clear rationale for partnership. Like, why would we want to, what are we looking to accomplish through a collaboration? And they put out a request for partnership, an RFP, just like you might for getting a consultant to do your strategic plan. Think about putting that out into the world and saying, hey, we have a clear case for partnership here, but we don't have anyone in our current list of relationships who really fits the bill. Is anyone interested in starting a conversation? But again, just be mindful that that conversation takes more time than working with an organization where you already have established trust. And so we also have in the workbook something for you to help thinking about what are those criteria that would be really important for you to know about in order to assess the fit and the possibilities. So, things from mission and values to the type of services they provide, the kind of impact that they're looking to have, all the way through looking at like their budget size, what kind of infrastructure might they have that is going to really help you implement that vision that you have for why a alliance would be really beneficial, and to also think about the mutual benefit that you bring to the table. So how might each organization benefit from the partnership? So you have those resources in your workbook. And
Yeah. So when you're ready to partner, as Melissa said, you may be beginning to think about that short list of organizations to approach. You can use that request for partnership. But this cultivation process of intentionally reaching out to people, determining once you have your why, if others are interested in exploring the possibilities for collaboration and consolidation. Often this can be organic or informal to the point of the formal request for partnership. But I think our call to action for you is that if you are truly serious about moving a partnership forward, don't just sit with, hey, would you like to collaborate? And then someone says, hey, we should get coffee to talk about how we should collaborate. And then seven
Yeah.
months go by and you haven't moved it forward.
Yep.
When someone really is ready, you must kind of move from, hey, let's have coffee to, hey, would you be willing to engage in a more formal process of discovery? And so, Melissa, I think we're going to pick up the pace as we drive through
Yeah.
our last few minutes here. But
Yes.
when you're ready to go, it's about kind of saying, are we ready to engage in a formal process? Can we come to
Yep.
agreements about what that process would look like? And what are some of the documents that we can use to move
Yep.
this from, hey, we should have coffee to, hey, let's seriously explore something?
Yep. And this is the section of the deck where I was referencing that these slides are really intended for you to be able to come back to later as a resource. So we're going to hit on the concepts that we have on these different pages, but just know that again, this is the section that's intended for you to be able to come back to later if you get to this place and you're like, okay, what are some of the things I need to keep in mind as we move forward? Developing a letter of intent is a really interesting moment because it really helps to call out the seriousness of the conversation. So it's
Mhm.
what Anne was saying, moving from the, hey, let's get coffee together and talk about if there's a there to, you know what, we're going to commit to a formal process here where we are going to talk about how we're going to create, test the seriousness of what it is that we're doing. Is there really a there here? And so things to consider are, roles, timeline, if you're bringing in somebody to help support this conversation, how those expenses will be handled, what kind of information you're going to share, how it'll be exchanged, and what are the confidentiality expectations. So this is again before you're getting into like formal negotiations. This is the we're going to get serious and structured about having a conversation around whether there is an opportunity for us to develop something formal here. And if it is a strategic consolidation, then we are talking about a formal due diligence process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that as we bring that joint design team together, you sign that letter of intent. There's really two parallel processes that need to happen. The first is agreeing that we're seeking to do something substantive here. So we're going to begin the due diligence process, which includes a real formal process of document exchange and review. The design of that is determined by the joint working group. You can use outside experts to review information. Anyone who's reviewing documents should sign a non-disclosure agreement, and some of this review work can inform structural selection ultimately. But the work of the joint design team is to develop that rationale for partnership, to do some information gathering around what is possible. But due diligence is a formal step when we're thinking about a structural or strategic consolidation.
Exactly. And in terms of that rationale for partnership, these are some great questions that you can come back to just in terms of, again, getting clear about what you're considering, what's the shared vision, what's the work that we want to do together, and over what period of time. How does each organization benefit, and how does the community benefit? And what does the work require of each party? So, as you start getting crisper and crisper, these are just some great questions that you can come back to and talk about with your partner to make sure that you're really on the same page and building that shared vision together. And again, this is just a reminder about getting that attitude right. So if this is win-win work, we need to avoid things like positional bargaining. Those are those flags in the ground that where we come into the conversation feeling like this is a sum game where we have to win. This is about the community winning. And so we want to avoid that kind of posturing. We want to agree to the rules of the negotiation process, focus on that common ground, and invent those opportunities for mutual gain. Again, this can be a very generative, exciting process to create something new. And it does also help to have that objective decision criteria in terms of just reminding ourselves of what is it that we are trying to do. Let's lean into that rationale and vision for the partnership and keep coming back to it as we make decisions along the way. In terms of the kinds of agreements that get developed, this is definitely a slide to come back to. Not going to go through all of these, but the point of this is that it really ranges based on what it is that you're trying to create. So if this is an informal collaboration, there may not be any documentation required. Maybe you have an MOU because you just want to be clear. This is where I always channel the great Brene Brown and say clear is kind. So as we think about where misses happen, it's when we don't establish and write down perhaps mutual expectations for what is going to happen. So the more that we can create clarity by writing things down and getting clear around things like data sharing, branding, communications, insurance as we start going down the line, governance, all of these kinds of issues, the better. We really need to make sure that we're being clear. And so these are just examples of different kinds of agreements that may be created in order to make sure that both the spirit and the details are clear in these different kinds of agreements that we may be making with each other. In terms of MOUs,
Melissa, you
and
want
can
me
you,
to take
yeah,
this one real
yeah,
quick? And we're going to kind
yeah.
of try to wrap up our content in a few minutes. But just in terms of using the MOU, we can use it really in two ways. It's a wonderful, flexible tool that can be used to govern multi-party collaborative work, stating the collaboration's goals, partner responsibilities, how financial contributions and staffing allocations will get handled, the day-to-day management and decision making, processes to address conflict, and processes to exit the collaboration. On the right-hand side, the use of the MOU. So I want you to think about sequencing in a joint party process. The joint party working groups get launched. The LOI describes the process. Due diligence happens, the rationale gets created, and we begin to deal with issues of bringing the two organizations together. These are the types of topics from structure to leadership to governance to financial to naming and other unique issues that surface in order for the legal transaction to be enacted. And so this use of an MOU, in some ways, for some discussions, is not always the go-to, but I find it's incredibly helpful to get as many of those agreements on paper before you move forward with an illegal enactment. And when to get the experts involved is really dependent, again, on the type of partnership that you're considering. I think if I had a call to action, it's a love for both accountants and lawyers to support you and your teams in this work. If you are considering substantive strategic partnerships that may combine your operations with others, please work with your accountants and your financial bookkeeper to ensure that your books are as organized and up to date as possible. If you have delayed audits, if you have challenges with your chart of accounts, I promise you that that will become an issue if you're seeking a substantive consolidation. Spending time and investing time there early is really important. Accountants can help with supporting closing audits, bringing financial systems together, and attorneys are very helpful throughout the process. They can provide guidance on structure based on vision, intent, and the results of the due diligence. They can support overseeing the MOU development and enacting the legal transaction and ensuring any compliance with governance and bylaws.
And then we come back to the human element, right? So again, we just want to acknowledge the push and pull. As you can imagine, as we're going through all of these technical exchanges of documents and, coming up with the details that are going into the MOU, that we can again butt up against some of these tensions that arise on the human level around power and what do we feel that we're giving up in this equation. And so throughout the process, how do we just continue to build trust with the parties that are at the table and make sure that folks really feel seen individually, but also, again, that we're bringing it back to the possibility of what we're creating together and the difference that it'll make for the communities that we serve. And so that takes us to the end of our journey. We really, again, hope that this has helped you see how it starts with acknowledging your experiences, building that internal clarity, and using that to assess relationships, envision shared work, and then select and implement the structure at the end. Being clear about your whys and being clear about that vision for shared work are just so important, and the rest will come out of that clarity. So, with that, we would like to stop recording and open the line up for some conversation.